Hello, my name is Tony. Imagine for a moment you are a homicidal, psychosexual Nazi sadist who likes hacking up female sex workers. Well, you may be, I don't know, do I? But if you're not, I know I shouldn't assume, but I'm assuming most of you aren't. Just imagine. Then consider, when would be the optimal time and place to do it? You know, the old Jack the Ripper thing. When would you be most likely to get the most opportunity to indulge the pastime and carry it off unimpeded and get away with it undetected? How about occupied Europe in the middle of a world war? With so much death and wholesale slaughter going on, who's gonna notice or even care? Man, any murdering fascist sex maniac would be in God's pocket. Could fill his jackboot, so to speak. So that's the general, no pun intended, idea behind the Night of the Generals. It's 1942 and some deviant nutbar is striping hookers in war-torn Warsaw, which is all well and good until he slips up by picking a wrong un, a prostitute who is in fact an undercover German agent, and that triggers an investigation by German military intelligence who are a little bit pissed at losing one of their valuable assets. Add to this, there was a witness who glimpsed the uniform the perp was wearing as he left the scene, and it was the uniform of a German general. This narrows the field in terms of suspects, because there were only 3 generals present in the city that night with their movements unaccounted for. What a great premise for a lean, slick, thrilling neo-noir workout. A war flick with a Jack the Ripper-esque narrative driving it. Should be smart, pacey, ferocious and well cool. Well, yes, and sort of. Let us explore further. Major Grau Omar Sharif is a determined investigator with the German military intelligence who resolves to discover which of the generals is the culprit. They are von Seidlitz Gabler, Charles Gray, Kallenberg, Donald Pleasance, and Tanz, Peter O'Toole. Gabler and Kallenberg work closely together and are both shady characters. Gabler has multiple adulterous affairs to his name, to which his wife Eleanor Coral Brown, an avid social climber, turns a blind eye for the sake of appearances. Kallenberg has no known relationships with anyone and is a shifty schemer, possibly on the lookout for ways to take down Hitler. Tanz is a favourite of Hitler's and a decorated hero of Stalingrad. His nickname is the Butcher. He's got obsessive-compulsive disorder, is a germaphobe, drinks like a sponge and chain-smokes furiously when out of uniform. He goes into a convulsive eye-twitching funk when looking upon a self-portrait by Vincent van Gogh, the artist painted in a lunatic asylum towards the end of his life. What else? He forbids talk of death or cemeteries, eats raw eggs and toast for breakfast, and if his bath water is 1 degree hotter or colder than 32 degrees, someone's gonna get royally fucked. Yeah, difficult to tell, really. Which one could be the deranged killer of hookers? It's a real head-scratcher. So anyway, Tanz is burning and blowing up parts of Warsaw with tanks to quell the resistance. He, like the other 2 generals, has little time for Grau's questions. To solve the problem, Gabler and Kallenberg arrange for Grau to be promoted and transferred to Paris as a lieutenant colonel. The guy is kicked into the long grass and the investigation dies on its ass. Meanwhile, Kallenberg's adjutant, Cope, Nigel Stock, canvasses his boss to find a safe role for his young cousin, Lance Corporal Kurt Hartmann, Tom Courtney. Hartmann, erroneously lauded as a war hero, begins a clandestine love affair with Gabler's daughter Ulrika, Joanna Pettit. Moving swiftly on to 1944, Gabler, Kallenberg, Cope and Hartmann are in Paris. Tanz, now a Waffen-SS general, is sent to the city in command of an SS Panzer division. Gabler and Kallenberg need to buy time before providing Tanz with the troops he has demanded. Reason being, they're embroiled in the Valkyrie plot to assassinate Hitler. They're waiting on the arrival of fellow conspirator and lead traitor Field Marshal Rommel, Christopher Plummer, before the plan is green-lighted and the Führer bumped off. As luck would have it, bad luck that is, Rommel is fatally wounded in transit. The 2 generals distract Tanz by ordering him to take leave for 2 days. They arrange for Hartmann to be his adjutant and chauffeur and take him on a sightseeing tour of the city. Very pissed off about this is Hartmann, as he had plans to meet with Ulrika, who is visiting Paris. During his little holiday, Tanz becomes drunker and madder. He orders Hartmann to procure a French prostitute for him, Monique Veronique Vendel. Tanz butchers her in her apartment and frames Hartmann for the murder. He's not a complete monster though, so he gives Hartmann some options. Option 1, he will either shoot Hartmann dead, blaming him for the killing, or option 2, Hartmann can desert and make a run for it, and Tanz will allow him until morning to make his getaway. Then he'll report the crime and blame him for the killing. Grau is still stationed in Paris. He's cultivated a working relationship and friendship with Police Inspector Morand, Philippe Noiret. Grau knows that Morand is a resistance chief but doesn't expose him. In return for his help digging up information on the 3 Nazi murder suspects, he even arranges the release of some resistant fighters from prison. Concluding that Tanz is the killer, Grau heads to his base of operations to arrest him. Unfortunately, Hitler has survived the assassination attempt, and the high-ranking conspirators have been exposed as traitors and betrayers. Tanz has taken charge of arranging for their arrests. When Grau levels his accusation, Tanz shoots him dead, explaining to his staff that he was one of the traitors and got what he deserved. Moving on to 1965, Morand is now an operative with Interpol. His attention is drawn to the murder of a prostitute in Hamburg, striking him as nearly identical to the killing of the women in Warsaw and Paris during the war. Feeling indebted to Grau, he tracks down and interviews Cope, now the owner of a string of bars, who is convinced that his cousin Hartmann was the perp. Hartmann was never seen again after he fled. Morand finds and speaks to Kallenberg and Gabler, who both survived the war. Gabler refers him to his daughter Ulrika, who has been estranged from her parents for many years. He discovers she has been living with Hartmann all this time. Tanz also survived and has recently been released from prison after serving 20 years for war crimes. A release that, oddly enough, coincides with the frenzied butchery of the prostitute in Hamburg. Confronting him at a Panzer Division reunion dinner, Morand produces Hartmann as his key witness. The gig is up. Tanz retires to a vacant room and blows his brains out. The end. Peter O'Toole and Omar Sharif are none too enthused about the film. Neither wanted to do it particularly. But producer Sam Spiegel asked them, and he's the guy who gave both men their big screen breaks with Lawrence of Arabia, and they felt they owed him something. Reportedly, bound by the terms of an old contract agreement, the combined fee of the 2 stars was less than that of Donald Pleasance individually. That must have stung. However, and in all fairness, both men give it something like their best shot. In fact, overall it boasts a superb cast with lots to enjoy in the performances delivered. O'Toole does a hypnotic, stark-staring mad impression, infused with a steady drip feed of twitching megalomania that is certainly best in class. Yes, it's arch, hyper-dramatic and theatrically exaggerated, but it's a shit ton of fun to watch. At the other end of the spectrum, Omar Sharif gives one of his most understated performances, a winning combination of steely intelligence undercut by flashes of compassionate humanity and careworn humour. Grau may not believe in Hitler or the war, but he does believe in justice and the law, and that no one is above it. Unfortunately for him and his principles, he's on a hide into nowhere trying to uphold and pay service to that concept in a Nazi-dominated crucible of war crimes and insanity. The support structure of Grey, Pleasance, Brown, Stock, Noiret, Courtney and Pettit, and a brief turn by Gordon Jackson as Sharif's intelligence subordinate, comprises a quite dazzling array of talent. For good measure, chuck in a cameo appearance by Christopher Plummer as Rommel, along with such Brit stalwarts as Patrick Allen, John Gregson and Harry Andrews, and the very last thing anyone is going to criticise is the sheer breadth and depth of the casting. The rest of it, though, is wide open. For a start, it's too long, and goes about its business too slowly. It seems to want to be a war epic, but that only usually works within the scope of a 2.5-hour runtime if there is a lot of war action to be going on with, and there isn't. This is because it's supposed to be a detective story about tracking down a merciless and depraved killer of women. The two don't need to be mutually exclusive, granted, and a police procedural set in wartime is a cool and workable proposition. Those parts of it do work well, but only when they're the focus. However, time is extended by a slow drag through the mechanics of the assassination attempt on Hitler, the death of Rommel, and a blow-by-blow tour of war-torn Paris, complete with 2 walkabouts in the same art gallery. We don't need to see all the background stuff in such detail right up in the foreground. Characters can report on or fill in such things as we go. Judicious trimming by 30 to 40 minutes would have resulted in a far leaner beast with greater concentration and clarity. I don't mind films that jump around in time, provided it's done in a narratively appropriate manner. The Night of the Generals flips between the events of the war and Morand's investigation in 1965, yet it does so in a club-footed, disorientated way. It's not a huge problem, but if it was a little less randomly implemented, the film would have flowed a little more smoothly instead of being faintly narratively erratic. Costing around $5.2 million, it wasn't a cheap enterprise, and what you get on the screen certainly succeeds in looking expensive. Henry Decay's cinematography is bright, bold and sumptuous, his capture of locations and interiors dripping with opulence and class. Maurice Jarre's score, whilst not his best war movie work, he did some absolute bangers, is a decent enough sonic driving force. Some major fault lies with the direction of veteran Anatol Litvak. He was 65 and in poor health throughout the shoot. The studio originally advised Spiegel to get a hot young director in place, but he based his decision on Litvak's experiences of making several American forces training films and propaganda pieces during World War II. But this was the 60s, and styles and public taste were evolving fast. Films like Robert Aldrich's The Dirty Dozen were ramping up the graphic violence and brutality levels in war movies. Hammer Studios had already pushed the envelope with what could be shown on screen in regard to graphic gore and viscera. By the end of '67, Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde would redefine the notion of cinematic bullets and bloodshed in a forensic and detailed fashion. The Night of the Generals is a film that doesn't seem to know what it wants to be. Litvak made a sort of bloodless, well-heeled, elegantly mounted movie better suited to the 1950s. Something that resembles a sweeping classical wartime or period drama. Instantly, it was outdated. It's supposed to be a film about a sadistic psychosexual maniac in a war zone who stabs a woman over 100 times. Yet it is seen to shy away from anything remotely visually explicit. Now it's something you can get away with, but you need to be Alfred Hitchcock shooting the shower scene in Psycho to make it work. Litvak wasn't that kind of artist. The Night of the Generals barely took $2.5 million at the box office. To all intents and purposes, it flopped. There are two distinct narratives here vying for space, the psycho thriller and the political thriller. Litvak had a grounding in classic noir with Sorry Wrong Number and The Snake Pit. And if he'd localised the focus on Grau chasing down Tans through the war-torn streets of Warsaw and Paris, then the film might have been better for it. It's laughably obvious from the outset that Tans is the murderer. The only thing he's missing, apart from his marbles, is a badge pinned next to his iron cross with the legend, "I butcher bitches, me." O'Toole just oozes misogyny and madness from the start, so there ain't much of a mystery to be solved. The entire Valkyrie plot belongs in another movie, and the time-shifting device should have come at the end as a conclusion to the story, 20 years later sort of gig. The way it's applied makes the wartime part a flashback with no one identifiable person flashing back to it. Come to think of it, which one person could have done that? Who would have been blessed with a detailed knowledge of the entire trajectory and content of events? There isn't anyone. So as flashbacks go, it has some serious structural issues. I can see how all this adds up to look and sound as if I don't like the film very much, and I will admit it is something of a source of frustration for me. Yet I find it now, as I always found it, quite absorbing and captivating to watch, because it includes moments of greatness, yes, greatness, that I have seldom seen replicated quite so passionately or with such impact in any other film. The first thing is the setup. A Jack the Ripper type serial killer who is a Nazi general in World War II is a genius idea. I love the concept. In another film that isn't this one, the guy would have been having the sort of ball David Warner's Ripper had in contemporary San Francisco in Time After Time. He'd be knocking them over like bloody dominoes with virtual impunity, sating his murderous desires repeatedly. Okay, so The Night of the Generals is quaintly restrained with a body count and doesn't go all out to capitalise or creatively exploit it, but I can't knock the idea of it or the atmosphere generated around it. Peter O'Toole, so it's been alleged by Sam Spiegel's biographer Natasha Fraser Cavazzoni, was so resentful of the chicken feed payment he was getting, deliberately played Tans as batshit crazy from the start. He completely obliterated any potential for character development by kicking off as insane and simply escalating it from that point. He also made it patently obvious that Tans was the killer, thus short-circuiting any mystery element there may have been. This was all resentment at Siegel, she alleges. Whether whether or not that's the case, I think it's a masterpiece of theatrical excess. From the twitching eye, how did he do that, to the almost myoclonic seizures of the hands and his chilling speech patterns. If you remember nothing else, you will remember O'Toole in full-on psycho mode. And you will remember him stood ramrod straight in his staff car, coordinating troops, tanks and flamethrowers as he supervises the systematic destruction of a large part of Warsaw with no flicker of human empathy as the bodies and buildings burn. Every time I see it, I hear this. I rode a tank, wore a general's rank, while the blitzkrieg raged and the bodies stank. A superb set piece that channels the Nazi mindset perfectly. Utter ideological ruthlessness, the ultimate manifestation of cancel culture, and a reminder why we must never allow it to happen again. Joanna Pettit simmers with acute sexuality that is quite alluring. She has an indefinable feminine quality and naive sincerity that frames her relationship with Hartman a convincing proposition, validated further by her faith in him, his innocence, so much so that she spends the rest of her life with him on some obscure farm. Love may not conquer all, but it will ultimately prevail, well, in certain cases. Then there's the scenes in the seedy bar with Tan staring fixatedly at the prostitute Monique. He burns with icy malevolence as she poses and smiles and smokes cigarettes with smouldering promiscuity at the bar like some perfectly glamorous, sexy Parisian painting brought to life. It's a striking and marvellously tense affair whereby the viewer knows exactly what's going to happen but can only watch helplessly as events take their course. It's almost voyeuristic in its decadent potency. For those reasons and a few others, I do enjoy the film despite my frustrations with it. It's a defiant throwback to old Hollywood in the face of cultural changes and advances in 60s movie making, which it almost completely ignores. It does its own thing in its own way, which is something I can respect. But predictably, it turned out to be something that didn't resonate with the public at large. Maybe one day someone will extract and craft a bloody wartime serial killer cat and mouse chiller from the great potential and promise held in its genesis. One day, something with shades of Hitchcock, Brian De Palma and Thomas Harris to inspire it. It was a missed opportunity that the Night of the Generals wasn't that day. Thank you for your time and attention. Feel free to do whatever you choose to do next. Hit like, don't like, comment, subscribe, check out my early access Patreon thing, or even make a welcome financial contribution via the thanks button. As is de rigueur for the course, I'll be back with something else sometime soon. Catch you later, pilgrims.